Welcome to the About Sex podcast, where we discuss
weather patterns.
Weather? Well, yeah, some clouds and stuff. Anyway, my name is Josh, and with me, as always, is my lovely wife, Angela Skirtu. Tell us who you are, Angela.
I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist and an ASEX certified sex therapist. And today, our guest is Shirley Melis, and she is the author of a memoir, Banged Up Heart, Dancing with Love and Loss. Hello, Shirley.
Hello.
Hello, Angela and Josh.
Hello.
Hey,
Thanks for joining us.
It's good to have you with us. So tell us a little about yourself.
Well, I'll start out by saying I live in New Mexico, about 30 minutes outside of Santa Fe, in a little Spanish village of some 250. Or as I mentioned earlier, 251. Someone just had a baby.
You got to count every number with that low numbers. You're like, we got one more.
We got one.
Don't let go of her.
I grew up in Northern California, but I spent a lot of time on the East Coast in the Washington, D.C. area. Cool. And I was a business writer and a travel writer for a long time. And actually planned to write a book when I retired, a book about women between the ages of 60 and 90 who've lived life and feel good about themselves and sort of aware of themselves. But I would say life interfered, and well, that's still on a back burner, but I had to write this memoir. And
yeah, let's get into the memoir.
It happened overnight. It was like 3 years writing the first draft, and then
Did you say 3 years? Wow.
Rewriting.
Yeah, I wondered what the process was like, because, I mean, this is a pretty, tough story. It's your history. What was that experience like, writing your memoir?
Well, I was pretty compelled. It was intense. I had sources. I wasn't an English major. I was a history major in college. My original sources were a lot of emails and a fairly detailed journal. And it sort of covers a 2.5-year time period during which a lot of drama occurred. Mm-hmm. And yet when I finished the first draft, and I should say I was advised by, I have a wonderful goddaughter who writes for middle school age children, but she read the first 60 pages and she said, Shirley, you've got to keep going. You've got other, people will be interested in this. She said, but you've got to write about Joe, my first husband. And she was crazy about him, and I was too. So I wrote about Joe. Then I decided to read, I thought I might as well write about my Greek lover and my troubled mother. I mean, my manuscript just kept growing. So at some point, and after 3 years, I met with an editor, and I said, please, if you can take this and tell me what's missing. I know something's missing, despite the length. So 2 weeks later, she calls me and she says, I know exactly what's missing. Well, she didn't tell me what. So we met again at the tea house in Santa Fe. And she says, for starters, she says, you have 3 books in one.
Oh.
I've made a note of how many pages you have in each. And she says, I think you should go with the one with the most pages because that's where your energy is. Mm. So that was John. I didn't shred everything else, but I actually sort of layered it into my story about John. Yeah. I mean, it's in there in reflections, or it sort of seeps in.
So is John the main focus of the memoir?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it's sort of. It starts with my meeting him, and then it ends 2.5 years later. Mm-hmm. So the rewriting. I mean, what I found is that I had written what I now call the visible story, and what I needed to do was write the inside story, and not being just easily introspective, I found that the questions my editor asked me really led me to inside, so that I could express feelings and then think of and then have insights about what was going on during this time.
I'm kind of curious, Shirley. So one of the things that happened in this story is that before you met John, you had a very weird date. Would you like to share a little bit about that weird date?
Oh, okay. I should, just to put it in context, I've been. It was about 2 years after Joe died that I walked into my office, and the receptionist steps out from, I was coming in after lunch, she steps out from behind the counter, and she said, Shirley, she said, she was not a subtle person, she said, what kind of do you have a social life?
It's a unique question.
Said, well, not exactly. And she says, girl, she says, you are alive. And you better remember that.
Yeah, don't forget.
You are alive.
That's
so,
cute.
I mean, she rattled my brain. And that weekend, it was at home, and I took off my wedding ring and my anniversary rings, and I put them, I just tucked them into little boxes in the back of a drawer. And then I felt totally naked. I said, oh my God, I'm sending a message I don't even believe in myself. But I stepped out.
You decided to get yourself out there. Well, I bet that happens for a lot of people, that when somebody you love, I mean, you were with Joe for a really long time, he passes away, and you almost just feel kind of like, what do I do now? Shell-shocked, yeah.
Yeah, it was, well, and then not long after that, a family friend, the wife of a family friend in North Carolina, died. And I was living in Reston, Virginia. I went to the memorial service, and I knew I was going to be in that area for Christmas because old friends had invited me for Christmas ever since Joe died, and well, for 2 years. So, and they lived in Raleigh. So I told Paul, I said, I'm going to be back here around the Christmas holidays, and he said, well, we should arrange, be sure to have dinner together. Well, so this, in my mind, became, I said, oh my gosh, it's sort of going to be my first official date after Joe's death. And I was anticipating this. I thought, he was a college professor, and he was a businessman. He'd done a lot of consulting. I had not spent that much time I didn't spend any time with him alone. I'd actually spent most of it with his wife and Joe. So I arrive in Raleigh, and I'm the night for dinner with Paul arrives. I mean, this is the day after Christmas, I guess. And he'd been talking about how after his wife died, his children hired a chef so he wouldn't have to cook, and blah, blah, blah. And he said, oh my gosh, there's so much great food. We have, I have dinner parties every week. And so he said, he said, why don't you come for dinner and we'll have one of the chef's dinners? I said, well, okay, all right. So I'm just going to get in, and I'm going to just read a bit, but he picks me up in Raleigh, and we drive to his place in Chapel Hill, and okay, here's the cook couldn't come yesterday because of the holiday, so we're eating what she made last week, he announced.
So he fed her leftovers, essentially, for a date.
Dishes of a delicious gourmet dinner suddenly gave way to images of stale, dried-out food, tasteless and worse. Wasn't my imagination?
It's like, he's not good at first impressions, is he?
The lemon wedges flabby. Why hadn't he suggested going out for dinner? As soon as we'd gotten through the shrimp, Paul stood up and cleared the empty glass bowls from the table. A buzzer sounded, and he reappeared with Tupperware containers filled with steaming side dishes that he placed on the table. A buzzer went off again as he made another trip to the microwave, returning with a plate that had a single thick fillet of beef in the center, which he placed in front of me. After he returned with the steak for himself, I easily cut into the tender fillet and closed my mouth on a piece that was absolutely chilled. I'm sorry, Paul, but my fillet is cold. Oh, I can fix that. He jumped up from the table. I'll just put it back in the microwave. So, in any case, things proceed, and at some point,
microwave steak.
He's so romantic.
Well, Shirley, go ahead. Well, Shirley Nagelschmidt, that being my married name, why did you want to have dinner with me?
Mm-hmm.
Taken aback by the question, I sat back in my chair and thought for a few seconds. The possibility of a romantic relationship had crossed my mind. Paul grinned, his thin lips stretching wide. I'd like to fly up to see you again on Valentine's Day. Oh, that might be nice. On the other hand, I thought, it might not be. Better, coupled with his apparent assumption that a microwave week-old dinner in the kitchen was an appropriate dinner date, wasn't computing as Valentine-worthy. Suddenly, he kissed me hard on the lips, on the mouth, his lips closed. And then we go on, and there are some more. Eventually, he's taking me home. I mean, back to Raleigh. It was pitch black, a moonless, starless night. He had just driven onto the highway heading to Raleigh when he announced, I can't get an erection because of the prostate surgery I had. Then went on to describe it in some detail. Joe had told me about the cancer. It was serious, and we'd been concerned about Paul's survival. His erectile function, or lack thereof, had never crossed my mind, at least not until now. His voice rose. It's been 17 years since I've been inside a woman.
Oh, wow.
Oh, my goodness.
He's blunt.
He's very to the point.
Where this clinical confession was going. But I'm taking treatments to correct the condition, and I'm doing this just for you.
Just for
I
you.
could feel my jaw drop. For me? Why me?
We
Why
just
not
had one date.
for Sharon, who'd had vested interest in the relationship? As if nearing the finish line of a race, he went on. Rest assured, I have no trouble finding the G-spot. I really didn't want to hear this, any of it. Not on a first date, maybe never. Nonetheless, my curiosity was piqued. What are the treatments? I asked, thankful for the cover of darkness. That's how I'll end that.
No, that's a great ending spot. And who does that on a first date? That's so strange.
I don't know.
Well, and some people are so sort of clueless about others. I mean, he was entirely just, I guess, insensitive. Covers it. I
would think like maybe unaware.
Oblivious.
Oblivious, yeah. Not that he's like, because he seems like a nice guy and all,
Either
he just didn't know what to do.
Oblivious to social norms, or it sounds, maybe he was a little nervous about it. I'm sure he's insecure about the ED stuff.
Yeah, that's hard too, because
So
if you're dealing with ED, I know a lot of the men that I work with who have ED really just worry, they worry if you'll like them after that, so I guess he's just like putting it out there up front.
Yeah, I'm sure he was really nervous, but I just was really disgusted. I mean, I was just I mean, it was like he said, I've met a lot of women.
Did he really?
I've met a lot of women since Sharon died or whatever, and he just, but none of them, he said, none of them appeal to me. And I said, in my head, I said, oh my God, he's English, it's not right. None of them appeals to me. Is what he should be. So I'm just sort of mentally correcting his English, and he's going on, and then he's
match made in heaven.
I just, oh God. And then he wants me to go on some cruise with him, and
on the first date.
I'm working, I'm working.
I got stuff to do.
Why don't you stop working, And then I had found it. I'd found a relative in the Czech Republic, a young fellow, and I'd arranged for him. He was going to Charles University, or he got accepted to Charles University, and I arranged for an internship for him in the summer at the Airports Authority where I was working. And I tell Paul, I want to be there for his name is Alesh. I said, and he says sort of, well, does he need protection? I said, he's never been to the States. dates before. I mean, this guy. Anyway, we were definitely not on the same track.
Yeah, definitely not a match.
So tell us a little bit. Oh, you want to ask the next question,
tell us,
Josh?
Let's talk a little bit about John. That was your second husband. What made John so special for you? When did you meet him?
Well, in part it was probably because of the experience with Paul.
Yeah.
Because after I met John when I was there in Raleigh for my date with Paul. It turns out the last minute, my friends, my Dick and Carrie, Dick's brother was John. John, at the last minute, flew to Raleigh to have Christmas with his brother and his wife. And they were my friends with whom I was staying. And so, I'd heard of him, but I didn't, had never met him before. So Christmas morning, and this is, I'm still anticipating my date with Paul. Everyone's getting ready. They're going to have a big dinner that night for 25, and it's all under control. And I'm sort of an exercise buff, and I just asked John if he'd want to go for a walk. Everyone else was busy. Would walk through the neighborhood. Sure, he says. So we take this walk, and we're just talking, and it was during. I mean, it was a very easy conversation. And so that's when I met him. I thought, we got back. I thought, well, we could be friends. I mean, he was nice.
It was a good connection right away. Sounds like.
Yeah, but it wasn't any sort of like, oh God, he's the one. No, I'm still thinking about Paul. I hadn't met. My trajectory is going toward the date with Paul. Mm-hmm. So John says to me, I guess it was the day. Well, because I saw Paul. Then John says, "Well, will I see you tomorrow?" There were two houses involved. I was staying in the house next door to where he was staying, and I said, "Well, I don't know what Carrie, my friend, has planned." I said, "But I'm going out to dinner with a family friend." And he said, "Well, then can I take you to the airport the next morning?" And I said, "Oh, sure," because I thought that would sort of be imposing on Paul to come back from Chapel Hill to Raleigh to pick me up. Well, anyway, okay. So that's how I met John, and it was like, he took me to the airport, and he said at even before dinner. He had said, I'm going to be on the East Coast this spring. I'm going to be seeing Dick and Carrie. I'd like to stop to see you. And I said, well, I'm at that point thinking, well, I might be involved with Paul. I said, yeah. Well, there are lots of interesting things to do in Washington. Sure? Okay. But, so why, when after the holidays, I'm back in Reston, Virginia, and here's an email from John. We, exchanged contact information, and then
it moved on from there.
I have an idea. He says, "Why don't I just come? Why don't I visit you?" And Martin Luther King. You have plans for Martin Luther King Jr. weekend? And I said, "Oh, no, do. I mean that sounds great." And
yeah, and the kind of the beginning of the book kind of goes through how you guys got connected and start to develop that romance. And then one thing you mentioned in the book actually is that, like, at some point, I think you knew that he had cancer, but you didn't really, you thought it was in remission. And why don't you tell me a little bit about that?
On that walk, he told me that at age 40, he'd been diagnosed with a rare cancer called Waldenstrom's macroglobulinemia. It's a blood cancer. And that he controlled it through periodic infusions of Rituxan, which is something like chemo but different.
Okay.
And told me that there was a backup treatment in the wings. And honestly, he was so positive about his health that I did not focus. I pummeled him with questions after we became sort of seriously involved with each other. I pummeled him with questions, but not about his health.
Interesting.
Do that. And I was more interested in his character and our differences because he was an honest-to-goodness rocket scientist. And I'd nearly been done in by algebra. And my high school principal who tutored me used to call me Euclid Melis, and I said, but when I pointed out our differences, John said, he just laughed. He says, well, I can't imagine being romantically involved with a scientist. He said, just consider the math and science as something odd I do in my work.
Well, they do say opposites attract.
So we went from there.
Okay.
And,
well, and so then what happened then when the cancer started to progress? So you guys, your romance kind of budded very quickly, and then...
Well, we just started before that. We crammed in a lot of travel, an African safari, a trip to France, to Brittany, France, and it was the summer, 2 summers. Well, after we'd been married, I think it was the second. I should have this. The second summer, we left Santa Fe on a 5,000-mile road trip to the Pacific Northwest to sort of share our childhoods with each other, and we get to the Olympic Peninsula, and we check into a place, a lodge in a place called Forks, and this was so that John could check out. I mean, he gave up. He took early retirement to do landscape photography. So wherever he goes, he has his cameras, and he wanted to go to this place so he could check out the nearby dramatic beaches with his camera. So this lodge is nestled in the woods, and it's rustic. I mean, our headboard was carved to look like antlers. And the next morning, I'm caressing. We're in bed. I'm caressing his face, and there's this bump on his forehead under his hairline. And I said, God, what is this? And he says, what are you talking about? And I said, there's a lump the size of a quail egg and right under your hair. And he said, I think I remember hitting my head after I was changing the cords on the computers under the desk in the condo in Santa Fe. And I said, that must have been quite a hit. I mean, it wasn't black and blue, but that...
Yeah. So that was that...
The explanation sounded plausible, so...
Did that end up being a tumor later?
So, several weeks later, he completed MRIs of the brain and his spine, and we left on another long scheduled trip to Santa Fe, and we just arrived that Friday morning, and we were at the airport, and his phone rings, and it's his oncologist, and he'd finished the MRI at like midnight the night before, telling him to come back immediately.
I see. So that was when everything was about to hit the fan.
So that was, and that's when, he said, he said he would talk it over with Shirley. So when he told me, he'd written down that there were tumors in the brain, and in the spine. And he said, but we can't go back. Right. He wanted to extend the trip, and he extended it. He made our return flights 3 days later, and on a Monday. So it was on a Sunday that he woke up and started to talk, and he couldn't complete a sentence, and it progressed from there. Became very it was harrowing to get. I knew we had to get back. I thought the cancer was out of control, sort of pressing on his motor.
Well, because in the book you mentioned he was kind of like sort of there, but like almost passing out, like he couldn't use his limbs at a certain point, right? Like when he had to be...
He was unstable on his legs. I mean, he was unstable. And So we did get back.
Yeah, it was a difficult time to get back, but you did. And so, I wanted to ask you a little bit about, like, what do you think is the hardest part about going through that? Like, you guys went through a lot of treatment and he did eventually pass. So what is the toughest part about going through treatments like that with somebody you love? What do you think?
Well, it was hard for me to give up hope. It was very hard. I kept, because it turned out that it wasn't the cancer that was causing his lack of stability and inability to articulate. It was a rampant infection.
Oh, yeah.
And that was terrifying for me, because he nearly died that night. And the infectious doctor, they talked to me and they said, he should have been treated in Santa Fe, should have been treated in Dallas. And it was on me. I just felt that it was my fault, and fortunately, it really was fortunate in many ways, not just that he did not die that night. And in fact, he lived another 9 months. And it was during that time that we sort of both actually thought he could beat it. The infection was dealt with, and then the cancer took the focus. And at some point, he opted against the last possible treatment, and he and registered for hospice. And I thought, and I heard him. He told the nurse, the hospice nurse, he said, "I'm doing this because I want it to be our last best time together." And and then he said he could envision how weak he would be after another round of chemo, and susceptible to yet another infection. And and I knew if he were hospitalized again, he would never get out. That was my take. And apparently he agreed with that. And so, but even, so when I still remember when the oncologist said, as we left and his office, when he said that, I said, "Should we call hospice?" He said, "I'll call hospice and you'll hear from them in the next couple of days." And then he said, he said, "It's not a science." He said, "I've been wrong. For the last time I ordered hospice for someone, they lived another year or more." So in the back of my mind was a hope that he would persist. So he was more accepting, but we had a good. That was the best part. Is we did have the last best time was really quite good.
Go on, ask
So
Josh.
at one point you speak in the book about assisted suicide and double suicide. So how did that conversation go? When did that come up?
Well, that was right after the oncologist. This is actually just before he did the hospice. We met with the oncologist, and he told John, he said, "There's one more treatment." And John said, "I'm not going to opt for that." And the oncologist, as though he hadn't heard him, said, "I want you to take the weekend to think about it, and then call me Monday, or come in and see me Monday." So that was a Friday, and on Sunday morning, we're sitting across from John. He's got the paper on his lap, and he hasn't picked it up, and he's looking very straight. I look at him, and he said, "What are you?" He said, "I've gotten you into something that I can't get out of, and there's nothing I can do." And he said, "I have the darkest thoughts, and there is nothing to do." And at some point, I didn't have I couldn't face what he couldn't tell me. And I said, do you want to speak to my therapist? I had a therapist. And he said, all right. Well, I called her, and she suggested her partner. So Monday morning, John and I went to see her partner. And I'm waiting for him in the waiting room. And maybe it was an hour. He comes out, and I asked him. I said, "So, how is this? How was it?" And he said, "Well, I think I depressed him more than anything else." He said, "I'm telling him things I can't tell anyone else." Yeah. And I thought, "Oh my God, that means he can't tell me." So then I'm feeling that he has this thing he can't tell me, and he's not one to sort of initiate stuff. I had sort of always, you have to ask the right question, and then he'll speak. We get home, and I just said to him, I said, "Are you thinking about suicide?" He said, "Yes." Okay. He said, "In fact," he said, "I'm thinking about double suicide." I said, "Oh my God."
Well, yeah, what was that like for you? Like,
I was sort of taken aback by that. I mean, I thought, my first husband, Joe, was someone who really, he thought about a lot of things. He had a lot of books on suicide, Derek Humphreys, and he said, he never wanted to be incapacitated, so he had sort of read up on how you could do these things. Mm-hmm. So I had books in my library, and I just pulled them out. And we started reading different passages to each other, and actually how-to passages. And finally, John says, he said, "We can't do it." And I said, "Why not?" And he said, "Because we would need a third person." Mm. And he said, you can't be sure of any of this unless there's a third person. Mm-hmm. And so it was during that I realized that I wasn't ready to die. I mean, I wanted to live. But I felt that if John, we knew he was going to die, and if I could help him in that way, I would. Hmm. So I said, what about Oregon? Whether they have assisted suicide. And he said, well, I don't have the strength to get there. And
wow. So that's just such
a
hard thing to talk about. Yeah, I couldn't imagine, but it's interesting that you already had the books. That's why it seems so casual in the book. Like, you just kind of, you're like, all right, let's read about this. And I just don't know if everybody would approach it that way.
Yeah.
Well, he was a scientist. He was very matter of fact.
Was that a calm conversation? Was that a matter of fact, like, okay, let's look up suicide?
It was.
Or were you crying? Was it emotional?
It was calm. I think I was stifling a lot.
Yeah.
But I kept saying, I've got to read this. I've got to understand it. And I've got to understand how I feel about it. Mm-hmm. And I finally, through it all, realized that there was not going to be a double suicide.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't going to be party to that. I wanted to live.
Well, spoiler alert, you're still alive.
Yeah.
I'm totally joking.
Yeah. They didn't end it.
She didn't end.
So here we say, in spite of the double suicide, here is Shirley.
Yeah. Well, no, it just seems like such a tough conversation.
Yeah.
So what kind of, I do want to ask you one thing. Like, if somebody were ever going through this, like either a long-term terminal illness like this, or if somebody were struggling with, considering that, like a suicide or an assisted suicide, what advice would you give to people to consider, to work through something like this?
You want to focus just on the suicide part, or
more the terminal illness? But I think that's a part of it. More terminal illness.
Yeah.
It's
no advice on suicide.
Yeah. Right.
Don't kill yourself.
It's so consuming. It's very consuming while you're going through it. I mean, I had a friend who said, you've got to get someone to help you. I said, I don't know what kind of help I could use. So finally I thought, well, maybe someone could prepare the meals. But John was actually he was pretty good. I mean, he started driving while, during this last period, he was driving, and he even went to an optical place, and he came back. He said, I just got new glasses, so he's perfectly healthy and just needed new glasses. And he said, I can see better than I have in a long time. And I thought, well, God, maybe he is going to be all right. These things sort of kept happening.
They give you a little hope along the way.
Yeah. So that sort of, kept giving me, I grabbed onto those glimmers of hope, or what I thought maybe were signs. So I had a routine. I mean, I would go to, at one point we both went to the health club and did yoga together and all that, but I kept doing that, and when John did not. And I did hire someone to come in and fix like a meal, a noonday meal that then I could heat up for, she would fix lunch for John and then fix something for dinner, and I could heat it up for dinner. But I had to do this. John was very much into gourmet cooking. He had recipes that he wanted prepared, and it was really funny because this person who was doing it might have had a little dyslexia. But in any case, she would ask him about some ingredient that wasn't in the recipe. Or she said, do you have any white wine? He said, yes, but I think you want red wine for this lamb ragu or whatever.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. But in any case.
Well, so it sounds like...
still better than microwave steaks, though. I mean,
yeah.
Well, the thing is, he hated to eat the same thing twice.
Oh, yeah.
So I had all these casserole recipes that were he said, I'm feeling so much better. He says, I'll do the cooking. Mm-hmm. He says, it's not worth it to have these casseroles, and I said, well, let me think about that. So I went downstairs. We were in a condo. I went down and got on the treadmill, and I'm thinking about it. I go upstairs. I said, we're doing this for me, not for you. And I said, you're the patient. And I said, and I'm not going to cook. And I don't really like casseroles either. They're so fattening.
Yeah, nobody does.
We just tolerate them.
No, it's something you eat. It's easy to cook, and you throw together for a whole big family. You're good.
But it sounds like one of the things that helped you, too, was just kind of sticking to your routine, still taking care of yourself, and, enjoying each moment. Right. Yeah,
You're right. And it really did help. And then there were friends who were there, who, as long as we could, we went to their place for dinner once in a while, and she fixed, she knew he liked pecan pie, so she had one, and then she gave him one to take home, and all of this. And at that point, his appetite never waned. It was like he enjoyed, but he stopped drinking. He used to he liked single malt scotch, and he's crazy about wine. But he said, I just can't drink it because it goes, he says, it just messes up my brain. He said, he was, so but I kept drinking.
As one does.
I could see that as a self-care tactic, too, here and there.
That's part of my routine.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's what I think you would need to do, is hang on to some sense of normalcy while you're in the chaos, essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was, I don't know if I'd answered your question, Josh, about what was the hardest. One of the hardest times for me was hearing the outcome of an MRI that detailed. It was read by the oncologist was away. It was his nurse who was reading this, and it was, to me, quite I mean, it was revealing of how serious his condition was, and that was before the infection, and I mean, it just it was just before the infection.
Yeah,
it was after the bump had been discovered. But
so, tell us a little bit about the very end when he passed. How did that come about? Was he in hospice?
About the what?
When he passed away, was he in hospice at that point?
Yeah, he was. So he was in hospice about 4 months. He had said to me that he didn't want to be institutionalized, and I said, well, then the hospice triage person or whatever came to the condo where he talked about what hospice is, and he left manuals, and John registered for it and all, and he said, give me the papers, I'm ready, I'm signing up right now. And finally, I decided I better read the manual. And as I'm reading this, I'm saying, oh my gosh, I said, John, if you get to be this bad, I said, I won't be able to take care of you. And he said, well, I said, but I'll hire people. He said, well, I don't want to be institutionalized. I said, don't worry, I'll hire people to help me. So and then the nurse and the social work, the nurse visited every week until John asked her to please not visit every week. He said, well, then I'll call you on the phone. Okay. And the social worker was more intermittent. But so there was one point when John just he fell, and I couldn't get him up, and then from that was maybe that covered a couple of days before the weekend, and then the weekend, and the hospice nurse is on duty is coming in to help me, and she said, I said, I've got to hire someone to help John get from his easy chair to the bathroom, and so, she says, he's got to be in bed, he can't be in a chair, he's got to be in bed. And I said, well, then I need a hospital bed. She says, well, the warehouse is closed now. We can't get you a hospital bed. And so Monday, I said, well, can you look at this list of hospice nurses that I could call? See, do you recognize any names on this in the manual? She says, well, it's been a long time since I was. She didn't recognize any of the names. So I just started calling because I felt I needed to get some coverage and help. And I sort of thought, well, all I need is 3 people, 8-hour shifts. That's 24 hours. Well, then I started calling and found out, someone works just on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and they work for 5 hours at a time. It just became a big mosaic of how to get the coverage.
Oh, wow.
And so Monday morning, when the first nurse showed up, caregiver, I said, just, help John drink some orange juice. And we had this little sort of tiny wheelchair that I had rented. And we got him into that, and the phone rings. And so it's the hospice person. She said, I'm the director of such and such, and we've got a bed for you. I said, well, thank goodness. When will it be delivered? And she says, no. She said, I don't mean a bed to be delivered. I mean, we've got an inpatient bed for John in our hospice in Arlington, Virginia. And I said, oh, well, she says, I've called John's nurse and the social worker, and I hope they get there before the transport people get there. So I hung up the phone. I went in to see the caregiver, and I pulled her away from John, and I told her what was happening. And she said, and then I said, I've got to go talk with John. So by this time, John was back in bed, and I told it, because it hit me, that this smacked of institutionalization. And I told him, this is what we're being offered. I felt relief. I thought, oh my God, he's going to go someplace where they know what they're doing. But then I realized that was, so I asked John what he thought, and he said, it's okay. It's okay.
Oh, wow.
So
He knew you needed the help.
So he did end up passing away in the hospice, right?
Yeah, he passed away in room number 2 of the hospice in Arlington, Virginia. About a week later, maybe, about that.
Okay.
Yeah. And
Well, would you like
so
to?
it was different from the death of my first husband was sudden, and a year after that, I thought I was doing all right, and until I went to have my annual physical, and doctors say, "Well, how are you doing?" And I just blurted out, "My husband died. What's happened to you this last year? My husband died," and I just started sobbing. And 2 of them said, "Well, are you seeing a therapist?" And I said, "No." And so, a year after Joe died, I joined a grief group. It was a hospice grief group, and found a wonderful therapist. And I guess I felt, I'm just going to say this now, I think that grief is it's such a heavy thing for a number of people, and I think it's hard for close friends to deal with my grief. And I felt the therapist was so helpful to me, because I think it's, friends don't know what to say or do, and most of my friends had never dealt with anyone, beloved person died.
That's definitely something I've noticed, as a therapist, that like a lot of my clients struggle, when you're dealing with this huge grief. What do you do? Who do you, like people will say, "I'm here for you if you need me," but nobody knows what to do to actually offer the need.
You don't know what to ask for.
Yeah.
So the best thing.
Yeah, and you don't.
The best thing somebody can do. If they have someone.
It was wonderful to have that therapist. So I was seeing the therapist all, when I met John, I was involved with the therapist. So, and it was very helpful to me. I think people should allow themselves to grieve, and I was working after the death of my first husband, and I thought it was a good thing to be able to go back to work in a structure where I had to focus on other people, not myself, not my grief. And I think that was good, but I think that's why I never really started grieving until a year later.
Yeah. Well, Shirley, we're about out of time on the podcast. Josh, was there any one last thing you wanted to say about that? Or?
No, I think that's it for today.
So this has been Shirley Melis, and she's the author of the book Banged Up Heart, a memoir, Dancing with Love and Loss.
Yeah, thank you so much
for joining us.
Shirley. Is there anything else you want to say to our listeners?
I would just say, if anyone is interested in the memoir, it's available through independent bookstores. It's on Amazon. It's also available as an ebook, and it's winning awards, which is nothing I anticipated. But
congratulations!
I'm very pleased.
Well, good for you. And of course, I always put in a plug for my stuff. So if you need therapy,
thank you.
Oh, okay.
Thank you for having me on your program.
Sure.
Of course. So if anybody wants to come in to see me, it's www.therapistinstlouis.com. And I'm also author of the book, Helping Couples Overcome Infidelity, a Therapist Manual, also available on Amazon. So
be sure to add us on Facebook, review us on iTunes, and send us your questions to aboutsexpodcast@gmail.com. I'm Joshua Skirtu.
And I'm Angela Skirtu.
Stay kinky, St. Louis.